Okay, welcome back to this week's lecture on Persia. And I thought what I'd do, instead of jumping right into Persia, talk a little bit about what was happening before the Persians started controlling the Middle East. And I want to talk about the Neo-Babylonians. And as you can see from this scene, you've got a group of people called the Neo-Babylonians. And the most important person to remember from this period is a man named Nebuchadnezzar II, who becomes the Neo-Babylonian king. And you might have heard his name before. I know he's on the movie Matrix, or the name is on the movie Matrix. Nebuchadnezzar II is important because what he ends up doing is taking over a good part of where modern-day Israel, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon is, and he moves a huge bunch of people out of that particular area and moves them back into Babylon. And these are the Jewish people. So he moves a large number of Jewish population out of this area, moves them into Babylonian Empire, and then moves a lot of Babylonians into that other area. So he's important too for Jewish history in that he destroys the temple. So the temple was where the Jewish people would aim towards when they're praying, and so on. So he's famous for that. And the reason I want to bring this up now is because when we talk about the Persian king called Cyrus the Great, I will remind you of what Nebuchadnezzar ended up doing. And here you have a map of the Persian Empire. So I'll talk about this in a second, but the Persians obviously take over the Neo-Babylonians, and this map is showing the furthest extent of their territory. So they push all the way into India in the east, and push into Egypt and modern-day Turkey, and just a tiny bit into Europe. So that's the furthest extent of their empire. And here I've given you a little better map of the Persian-controlled areas. This also includes on the map something called the Royal Road, which is built by the Persians. It runs from the center of Persian-controlled territory up through modern-day Turkey. And this has a really important impact on what I want to talk about next, which is the introduction of Croesus into Persian history. So when Cyrus the Great became king of Persia, it wasn't just an easy overnight thing. So of course he had a lot of battles to do with the people who were in control of that area before, which are the Neo-Babylonians. And whenever you've got a change of government, it's usually a fairly dangerous time period because your enemies know that you're vulnerable. So Cyrus the Great definitely had some enemies. The greatest one that he had to deal with was a man called Croesus. And Croesus was a king of Lydia. And if you move backwards a bit on the video to look at that map, you'll see that it's in the western part of Turkey. So Croesus realizes that he can take advantage of this period when Cyrus the Great first became king, so he decides to attack. Now Croesus considered himself to be a Greek. So what Croesus did before he attacked, he went to Delphi. And Delphi is very famous for having an oracle there. And what he did was he brought a huge amount of wealth and asked the Delphic oracle what would happen if he attacked the kingdom of Cyrus the Great. Now the oracle, if you know any of the history about this particular oracle, it never gives a yes or no answer, and it's never very clear. So the answer that the oracle gave Croesus was that a great kingdom will fall. So if Croesus attacks the Persians, a great kingdom will fall. So Croesus got really excited about this, figured it was the kingdom of Cyrus the Great that was going to fall. So Croesus also decides to try and get allies with his attack. So he's got three allies. One is the Babylonians, another the Egyptians, and the third group of people he asks to fight against Cyrus the Great are the Spartans from Greece. So all three agree to fight against Cyrus the Great. Now what happens is that Croesus goes back home. He's got the Delphic oracle reading, and he decides not to wait for his allies. So he ends up attacking Cyrus the Great. And I just showed you the map and talked a little bit about the Royal Road. Now this Royal Road was built, and according to Herodotus, who's considered to be the father of history, this Royal Road allowed people to get from one end of the Persian Empire to another in an extremely short period of time. Then what Cyrus ends up doing is gathering up his army and then traveling along this royal road and attacking Croesus. Now, Croesus, as I said, was fully believing that he would win this war. So the battle starts and he loses. So remember the Delphic oracle, a great kingdom will fall. Well, Croesus thought that that was Cyrus the Great's Persia. Well, it turns out that the Delphic oracle was correct. A great kingdom did fall, but it was Croesus. Okay, so if you remember, I told you that Cyrus the Great had three enemies that made alliances with Croesus. So you've got the Babylonians, you've got the Egyptians, and you have the Spartans. So Cyrus the Great knew about these enemies, and he decided to go after them one after the other. So first he went after the Babylonians and defeated them. Then he didn't attack Sparta, but the Spartans were sort of nervous about this whole thing, and they sent an embassy to him. And Cyrus the Great essentially just blew him off. He said, "You are too tiny, too small group of people to even come to my notice." So he sent the Spartans packing home. So he didn't attack them, but he just totally ignored him. And then, of course, you've got Egypt. Now, Cyrus the Great did not end up attacking Egypt, partly because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, he is traveling around his kingdom trying to solidify his power, and he goes out to Central Asia, and he ends up dying in battle. What you're looking at here is an image on a Greek vase, and you've got Croesus sitting on a funeral pyre or a fire. And what you're looking at is a servant who is about to light this fire. And you can see Croesus doing something with a bowl. What he's doing is he's offering a sacrifice. So he put wine in this bowl and then turned it over, and which of course would get the fire hotter, and he's essentially offering himself as a sacrifice because, as I just told you, he lost his war with Cyrus and he was captured. So he decided to kill himself on this pyre. Now, there's a couple different stories about what happened to Croesus here. Probably the most famous one is that as the fire is being set and he's doing a sacrifice, Apollo shows up and pours rain on top of this fire so Croesus doesn't die. Regardless of what happened to him, we know that Cyrus the Great spares him, and then Croesus becomes a Persian advisor. After the death of Cyrus, he had a son named Cambyses II, Cambyses, so Cambyses II. So he takes control, becomes the king of the Persians, and he knows that the Egyptians tried to attack his father. So what Cambyses II does is he takes a massive Persian army and sweeps through the Middle East and goes down into Egypt and takes Egypt over during this period. So Egypt becomes part of the Persian Empire. Now, while he was in Egypt, he heard about political problems at home, and he decided to leave his army in Egypt but go back to Persia. So on his way back, he mysteriously dies. We don't know exactly what happened to him, but the person who takes over power in Persia was not of the royal family, and his name was Darius. So we'll look at him in the next scene. Actually, this next scene is not an image of Darius, but it is the mausoleum of Cyrus the Great, which still stands today. And this is an image of Darius. So you've got Cyrus the Great, you've got his son Cambyses II, and then Darius comes along. So this is a rock relief of Darius in one of his palaces, and he was a fairly strong king, and we will talk a little bit about him. I'll show you in the next scene one of his palaces, and then a little bit of what he had to do to convince the Persian people that he was a true king. What you're looking at here is part of the remains of royal city of Darius, and he spent quite a bit of his time building up his cities. I had mentioned that Darius was not of the royal family, so he had to convince the Persians that he was worthy of being king. So what he did was he put out a bunch of royal propaganda. And the scene you're looking at here is what he ended up doing. So on the left side, I've got a picture of Ashurbanipal. Now, we didn't talk about him, although I did mention him in the very beginning in Mesopotamian history. He was known as the Scholar King. So Ashurbanipal, as you can see from this photo, he's fighting with a lion. He's doing hand-to-hand combat with a lion, and this is fairly typical in terms of royal iconography. Now, the image to the right, this is a 12-foot tall rock relief showing Darius. Now, if you look closely at this animal, this is not a lion. This is some type of mythical creature. So it's got a lion's body. What you have here is a royal seal from the time of Darius, and it's showing him in his chariot. He's got a chariot driver, and you can see that he's killing lions with a bow and arrow. He's already killed one. It's under his horse, and he's got another one that's standing up on its back legs, and it is about to be hit by the arrows. Again, this is just showing the bravery of the king. Let's talk a little bit about the Achaemenid government. Obviously, you know that there's a king. Now, the king of Persia was chosen by its main god, and this god was named Ahura Mazda. And we know that the Persians had a highly organized bureaucracy, meaning that they had a whole army of people below that were running the government. So you've got the king and all his administrators. And of course, one of the reasons why you'd be chosen as an administrator during this period is because you could write. So up here on the scene, I just have scribes, but it's the people who can read and write who are running the government. You had a fairly large treasury during this time because they were very good at collecting taxes. And before I forget, the native Persian people were not taxed. So it's everyone else. So all the captive, the conquered people, they would be paying taxes to the Persians, but the native Persians would not be taxed. You also have this idea of a harem, and this is just really the royal family that surrounded the Persian kings. What's really interesting too about the time of the Achaemenids is that they used part of Hammurabi's law code. If you remember way back to the time of Mesopotamia, so Hammurabi was ruling around 1800 BC. We're talking about 500 BC now, so it's a long time period to go by, and still using very similar laws. Okay, I'm not quite sure why I have this slide in here because I already talked about it. So native Persians are not taxed, and the Persians were really good about collecting all of these taxes. Now, of course, you have to remember, you collect taxes and then it has to be spent. A lot of the money was spent building these cities that we've talked about and keeping up the army. I'm going to skip a big chunk of Persian history because I think it's better to cover the time period between about 500 BC to the 330s BC during the week that we cover Greece. Because what you find is around 500 BC, you've got the Greeks and the Persians going to war, and it's referred to as the Persian War. But what I want to do now is, we'll talk about that when we cover Greece. I want to skip down to the time of Alexander the Great in the 330s BC. So Alexander the Great, we've already talked about him. He had a big impact on India, and he also had a big impact on Persia. So he ended up going to war with the Persians primarily because of what had happened way back in the 500s BC with the Persian War. So again, we'll talk about that in a bit. But anyway, what you've got here on this mosaic, which is coming from Pompeii, is Alexander the Great on the left, looking fairly young because he was young. And on the right, you've got the Persian king Darius III. So not the original Darius, he's Darius III. We're now talking about the 330s BC. Alexander the Great decides to invade Persia and take it over. And this is in revenge of what had happened during the Persian Wars back in 500 BC and the early 400s BC. Now, Alexander and Darius III had quite a few battles. Two really major ones. The first one, Alexander and Darius meet on the battle, and Darius decides he's losing, and then he leaves the battlefield. So Alexander thinks that he's now the king of Persia. So Alexander goes into Egypt, comes out of Egypt, and then goes back into Persian territory and has another battle with Darius III. And this time, Darius III brought his entire family to this particular battle, all of his wives, his mother-in-laws, and so on. And he does this big battle with Alexander. And the story is that Alexander sees Darius III across the battlefield, and Alexander jumps in his chariot, chases down Darius III, and Darius III hightails it out of there. He gets in his own chariot and leaves his entire army, and, probably even worse, leaves his entire family. So Alexander wins this battle, and he wins the entire royal Persian family. So Darius III ends up fleeing the battlefield. And let me tell you a little bit about what happened after this. So Alexander decides to pursue Darius III, and he pursues him into Central Asia. Now, Darius III is going to Central Asia because he has a cousin who's ruling a very small kingdom, and his cousin's name is Bessus. And Darius III thinks that going to Bessus will be a safe thing, but Bessus has other plans. He plans on capturing his cousin, Darius III, and turning him over to Alexander the Great. So, and this is exactly what happens. So what Bessus does, he captures his cousin, puts him in a cage, essentially, on a cart, and then leads the cart off to Alexander. Now, Alexander sees this cart coming, and we don't know exactly what happened, but by the time it reaches Alexander the Great, Darius III is dead. He either killed himself, or the troops that were taking him to Alexander killed him. Not quite sure, again, not quite sure what was happening. Alexander, though, was furious. He always had great respect for royalty. And so what he did was he ordered that the body of Darius III be taken deep into Persian territory and then given a state funeral. He then turned around and started to chase Bessus, who, of course, was thinking he was going to get a reward. And his reward was to be killed. So Alexander the Great has great respect for royalty, even though they're fighting with him, and he doesn't like it when someone kills royalty. Alexander dies in Persia, and unfortunately for Alexander, he didn't name a successor. So what happens to his entire empire is it essentially falls apart, and you've got three generals who take over. So you've got Seleucus, or Seleucid I, you've got Ptolemy, and you've got Antigonus. So what happens is that these three people essentially set up their own kingdoms, and you start a period in Persian history called Hellenism. And the Hellenes were the Greeks. So Hellenism is the spreading of Greek ideas. Now, Hellenism plays a really big part in Middle Eastern history, because what happens is the people who are in charge of the government are essentially Greeks and Macedonians, and they speak Greek, they act like they're Greek, or they act like Greeks, they build houses in the Greek style, they read Greek philosophy, they build Greek-style buildings, and the native Persians want to be like them. So you find a lot of Persian culture influenced by Greek culture, which is exactly what Hellenism is. Now, moving forward to this particular scene, starting in fairly early on, like around 200 BC, you've got some of the native Persians starting to fight back. And in 171 BC, you've got a new dynasty started, and this is the Parthian Empire. So the Parthians are Persian. They kick the Greek rulers out, and they start to rule themselves again. So you've got the Achaemenid dynasty, which is ended by Alexander the Great, and then his overall rule is ended at his death, and you've got Hellenism. And then starting around 171 BC, you've got new Persians taking control, and these are the Parthians. Parthian history is really interesting, primarily because when they take over, you would sort of expect them to get rid of all things Greek, and they didn't do that. So when they took control, they left the Greek style of governing alone. They had coins that they minted, which were newly minted coins, but they left the Greek on them. So again, you would expect them to get rid of all things Greek, and they didn't do this. So you've got government structures that are Greek, you've got coins that are written in Greek, and one thing they do is they borrow quite a bit from the Achaemenid dynasty. So they're true Persians, and as I put here on this scene, in the royal court they do speak Persian. Lots of people now are speaking Greek and Persian, but the royal court is speaking Persian. Another thing that's interesting about the Parthians is that they build not just one capital city, but they build a few of them, and they travel between these capitals. So they lift up the whole government and move it to another city. And what they tend to do is that in the summer in the Middle East, it's blazing hot, especially in the Tigris and Euphrates, that area where they have their one of their capital cities. So no king wants to bake at 150 degrees. So what they did was they built some royal cities up in the mountains. So in the summer they'd go up in the mountains where it's cool and rule, and then in the winter they would go down into the plain where it's not as cold as it is in the winter. Now this creation of a number of different capital cities ends up saving the Parthians when the Romans come along, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And this first part of the scene, I really didn't even have to tell you this. So when you've got a government that's moving around a lot, they naturally do not have a strong bureaucracy. So not a very strong centralized government, essentially just a weak centralized government. And again, that's because they're moving around. But in the end, this actually saves them because, as I have on the scene, one of the capital cities is named Ctesiphon, and it was captured by the Romans numerous times, so 116 AD, 165 AD, and 198 AD. And usually when a capital city is captured, the war is essentially over. But the Romans couldn't conquer the Parthians because they kept moving away to their different cities every time the Romans invaded. Another interesting part of Parthian history is that the Silk Road directly affected their economy. So you find contacts with China fairly early on in their rule, and you've got the exchange of embassies between China and the Parthian Persians. And you also have these agreements that each side will protect the Silk Road, which makes total sense because you've got a lot of wealth moving back and forth, and it's a great place for bandits. So both countries decided to protect the Silk Road to keep their economies strong. Okay, and most of the rest of the Persian history we'll be talking about is really the interactions between Persia and Rome. So the Parthians started fighting with the Romans when the Romans started invading into Parthian territory. So one of the earliest encounters was with a general named Crassus, a Roman general named Crassus. He didn't make it very far and he was defeated, but they kept trying over and over again. You've got an area in far northern Mesopotamia called Armenia, and the Romans wanted to control Armenia, and the Parthians wanted to control Armenia. So both groups fought over this country almost constantly. Then you got a pretty deep invasion by Emperor Trajan, who's a Roman emperor, and he went all the way down to the Persian Gulf. So he captured these capital cities, Ctesiphon, he captured Susa, and made it all the way to the Persian Gulf, and then he couldn't go any further. And then he started having trouble, and he had to retreat out of Parthian territory, and it was really left to the next emperor, who was Emperor Hadrian in 17, who had to deal with this whole mess that Trajan had started. So what Hadrian had to do is essentially give back all the territory that Trajan had captured, and again, it was just sort of a big mess. But this is the first time you've got these major interactions, and I'll tell you right now, the Parthians or Persians start fighting with the Romans now, so we'll say 1st century AD, and they fight until the early 600s AD, so almost 600 years of fighting. Okay, let's talk about the end of the Parthians. So, as I mentioned, you've got them moving around to different parts of their empire, which really saved them from Rome. Now, Rome was having some problems too at the end of the 100s. We've got various civil wars, and of course, whenever you've got a civil war in whatever country it is, your enemies take advantage of this. So you've got a civil war in 193, and the Parthians tried to take back Roman Mesopotamia, which the Romans had conquered quite a bit ago. They were defeated by a very famous Roman general named Septimius Severus, and the defeat was so decisive that the Roman people and Senate dedicated a big triumphal arch to Septimius Severus. It's called the Arch of Septimius Severus, and I'll show you a picture of this when we get to Roman history. Then in 224, you've got a king named Artaxerxes, and he's a Persian, but he starts the last great dynasty in Persian history called the Sasanian dynasty, which we'll talk about next. All right, as I just mentioned, you've got Artaxerxes I, who's a king that was ruling in a small area within the Parthian Empire. He rises up and takes over the Parthians, which starts his own dynasty, the Sasanian dynasty. And as I said, this is the greatest one. It's also the last one for Persian history. The king that I really want us to focus on during this period, though, is Shapur I. So he rules 241 to 272. Now, Shapur I is famous both in Roman history and in Persian history because of the defeats that he inflicted on the Romans. So you've got three Roman emperors that were definitely affected by Shapur. The first one is Emperor Gordian III. He was a teenager when he became emperor and decided to prove his bravery by invading Mesopotamia. He made it quite deep into Mesopotamian territory, but he didn't plan ahead for supply lines. So you've got a large number of Roman troops in Mesopotamia, and they're essentially cut off. The Romans cut them off, and there aren't supplies coming in. And the Roman troops actually killed Gordian III. The next emperor to have to deal with all this mess, which isn't on this scene, is an emperor named Philip. So you've got Emperor Gordian III killed. You've got all these Roman troops essentially trapped in Mesopotamia, and it's Emperor Philip who is the one who has to deal with Shapur. And they make the deal that the Roman troops can leave, but the border had to be given back, so the Romans had to retreat back into Roman Mesopotamia. And to make it even worse on the Romans, Philip had to pay an indemnity. So took blame for the invasion, and then he had to pay tribute to the Persians forever. That was the deal. Now this didn't last very long. Philip dies, and then ultimately you've got another emperor named Valerian coming into power. So Valerian decides he's going to break this peace treaty, and he invades Persian territory. Now, unfortunately for Valerian, he gets captured, even though he takes a very large army, like 60,000 people, into Mesopotamia. He's captured, and what's really interesting about this is that the Romans make no attempt to rescue him. So you've got a captured Roman emperor, captured by Shapur, and the story about Valerian is that he dies about a year after he was captured, and Shapur, at least the story goes, is that Shapur had him stuffed and used him as a footstool. So fairly demeaning, probably a bit of propaganda there, but fairly demeaning for the Romans, and of course great for Shapur. What you're looking at here is a very famous rock relief, and what you've got is Shapur I sitting on his horse. And you've got a kneeling person down at the bottom, that's Philip. So Philip, remember, he's the one who has to give back the territory and then pay an indemnity. Now the person that Shapur has on his hand, if you look at that, you've got a guy standing up, and Shapur's hand is around his wrist. That is Valerian, the captured emperor. There's also another similar rock relief which shows probably a young person under the horse of Shapur, and of course that must be Gordian III, even though Gordian III wasn't directly killed by Shapur. Circumstances certainly led to his death. So this is rock relief, royal propaganda, good stuff for Shapur I, and pretty awful stuff for the Romans. Okay, what I want to do now is just skip forward and to the end of the Persians. So we just looked at Shapur, who's ruling in the middle of the 200s. Jumping forward to the 600s, you've got these massive battles between the Persians and the Romans. And as I mentioned, they've been fighting for 600 years. You've got fairly large armies with Emperor Maurice and the Persian Sasanian king Khosrow II. What you have is a Persian invasion into Roman-held territory, and they make some fairly large gains. So they take Syria 611, Jerusalem 614, they take Egypt and 619 and finish that up by 621. Then you've got the Romans fighting back, and the Romans retake Egypt, they retake Jerusalem, they retake Syria, but by then you've got both of them fairly exhausted. And then you get the rise of Islam. And we'll talk about this the very last week, but the Muslims rise up and they start sending armies northwards. And of course, north you've got Roman territory and you've got the Persians. So in 642, which isn't that it's fairly close to the time period when they were fighting with the Romans and taking and then losing all that territory, the Muslims come in and totally take them over. So by 642, you have no Persian Empire. It starts with Cyrus the Great in the 500s BC, lasts about 1100 years, but it was so exhausted from fighting with the Romans so much that they couldn't handle another invasion by another enemy. So 642 is when you have the end of the Persians.